David Oppenheimer is our guest. He's a professor at Berkeley Law, and we're talking about he's leading us through three stages of affirmative action and how that's going to affect us. So take us back, and you say the first way in education is race.
That's right. Schools taking account of race and trying to admit a class that is racially and ethnically diverse.
And why?
Well, one, because diversity has educational benefit in the classroom and beyond the classroom in the school. Two, because it's important to have diversity among the graduates of our top universities in terms of training the leadership for tomorrow, so that we have diversity across our military leaders, the diversity in terms of our government leaders, diversity in terms of our boardrooms, that racial minorities are not left out.
Okay.
So it's important for both of those reasons.
Now, is race-based admissions still possible in universities in California?
Well, in California, for private universities, yes. For public universities, no. So at Berkeley, we can't consider race or ethnicity. At Stanford, they can and do.
Why?
Proposition 209, passed by the voters in 1996.
Okay, and so that's a value, but you're limited. And so what's your hope here, the best outcome of the race-based again?
Well, I think that it's important to recognize that for private schools across the United States and for public schools in all but a few states, race-based affirmative action remains legal and remains an important part of an overall approach to promoting diversity in the classroom and promoting diversity in the institution.
Okay, so, and that's a fairly easy concept for us to grasp. You have 100 students, and a private university could say, we're going to set aside 10 for African American, 10 for Latino, or so on. And
typically not setting aside, though.
Okay.
If you're setting aside, that's a quota. And quotas are clearly not permitted for public universities,
right,
and are probably not permitted for private universities. Rather, what a school can do is say that as we look at the applications, one of the things that we can look at is, what will this student add? Is this student a musician? Is this student an athlete? Is this student somebody who has terrific accomplishments? Is this student somebody who's overcome a great deal of disadvantage? Will this student add racial or ethnic diversity? All of those are questions the school can ask in making the overall decision, who are we going to offer admission to, who will we not? But what I'd like to turn to, because it's been an interesting phase in my own research on this, is where Dr. King stood on all of this. Because, you know, Dr. King is often described as someone who believed in colorblindness based on his I Have a Dream speech, where he talked about his dream of a time when his children would be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And so I started looking at the question, well, what did Dr. King have to say about these three different kinds of affirmative action? It wasn't called affirmative action at that time. The word hadn't yet come into common usage. But what I found, and it took me a while to get there, is that Dr. King's answer was that we need all three of these things. They are not mutually exclusive. It's not a question of choosing one over the other. All of them are beneficial. And I think that's a very important lesson for us to learn.
Race, class, and geography.
That's right, that all of them. That's right, all the race, class, geography. And can I tell you a little bit about what I've learned about Dr. King's work? That starting with the idea of race-based admissions, okay? Dr. King, in 1962, began a project called Operation Breadbasket, which was ultimately taken over after his death. Well, actually, while he was still alive, he ran it with Jesse Jackson, who was one of his chief aides. And then after his murder, Jesse Jackson took over the program. And the idea of Operation Breadbasket was to go into minority communities in which there were employers who were not employing black employees, and go to them and say, we insist that you have a percentage of black employees that is proportional to the black community that you serve or the community from which you draw your employees. And if you're not willing to do that, we're going to boycott you. We're going to keep you out of business. We're going to take you out of business. So this was a very serious threat to businesses who had traditionally not hired black employees. And it started in Atlanta. It was very successful in Atlanta. It created thousands of jobs for black people in Atlanta. Then Jesse Jackson took it with Dr. King to Chicago, and there were boycotts of many businesses in Chicago. And the result of that was, again, thousands of jobs for black workers in Chicago and boycotts of major businesses there. This was a very important part of Dr. King's civil rights strategy. But it wasn't the only thing. So this was a racial quota approach. But it wasn't the only thing that he was believing in, that he was supporting, that he was advocating for. Because he also advocated for the two other forms of affirmative action that we started out talking about today. That is, he was also talking about affirmative action based on class, and he was also talking about affirmative action based on geography. And it wasn't that he supported only racial quotas in employment. He was supporting all three of these kinds of affirmative action.
Why are you so interested in this?
Well, I teach at one of the great universities of the world. I teach at a university that, until Prop 209, had very large numbers of black students. We now have a much smaller number of black students. And I think that affects what happens in my classroom, and I think it affects what happens in our society. I think it's bad for California that we're not training as many black leaders as we were when Berkeley and UCLA and the other top public universities in California had a very affirmative action program, which we can't have anymore. And I think it's bad for the learning environment when I'm teaching in the classroom and often teaching about race. And there are so few black students and so few Latino students in my classroom. So both of those reasons.
Right, we're talking about minorities represent David Oppenheimer. When we come back, we're going to ask him a bit about himself and then deal more with race, class, and geographic balance in higher education.